As a child, I was never very good at point-and-click adventures and simply assumed they were all bad. As an adult, I'm still arguably not very good at them, but recognise that they can indeed be good. At least some. Welcome, my name's Azadesh and welcome to another Star Trek game retrospective. Released in 1996, Deep Space Nine Harbinger is essentially what you'd get if you combined Myst with Rebel Assault and added a Star Trek license. Now, the interesting thing here is that both Myst and Rebel Assault released in 1993, and apart from Rebel Assault's crushing difficulty, were both generally well received. However, in 1996, the formula was starting to age, as many games were making the move to a 3D world, or at least more of a 3D world than the aforementioned titles. These aging mechanics certainly didn't do any favours in overall reception for Harbinger, with mainstream publications GameSpot and Next Magazine awarding it a 5 and a 2 out of 10 respectively, making it one of the lowest scoring Star Trek licensed games ever released. Now, I will say, reading the GameSpot review, it's pretty apparent that the reviewer was not a fan of the television series, which is abundantly evident by starting off the review by saying, Deep Space Nine is a rather slow, dragging show. And look, my personal view is that if you are reviewing a licensed game, you should at least be reasonably objective in your love or hate for the source material. That's what I try to be, but alas, this review is 25 years old, so it's probably not worth looking too much into. In terms of where I personally stand on Harbinger's rating, it's an interesting case. The first half of the game is pretty good. It's got great storytelling, challenging but fair puzzles, and a nice mixture of action to break up the exploration. The second half, however, features one of the worst segments I have ever played in a video game, maybe ever. And if you've played Harbinger, I can virtually guarantee you know exactly what I'm talking about. And for those of you who haven't, don't worry, I'll get to it shortly. If I excluded this segment from the rating, the game would probably be a solid 7 for me, without a doubt. Unfortunately though, it's impossible to objectively remove this from consideration, given it's a required component of progression within the game. With this in mind, while I don't necessarily agree with the original reasons for the poor reception, I do agree with the ultimate rating. The version we're playing today is the original DOS version, although as was quite common for the time, there was also a Mac version available. There's nothing in the way of quality of life or widescreen mods available here, so what you see is what you get. Now, while I largely enjoyed the later seasons of DS9 and the overall Dominion War plotline, one of the things I did miss from the first few seasons was the Monster of the Week and exploration-focused plotlines. And it's this exploration-focused plotline that is one of Harbinger's greatest strengths. You're getting a completely original story here, which fits perfectly into the TV show's overall narrative, complete with excellent writing and truly exceptional voice acting, with many of the main cast reprising their roles. Honestly, all of the voice acting is great, but the performances from Renee Auberjonois and Armin Shimmerman are exceptional and really pulls you into the story like only the original cast could.
I'm telling you, it just disappeared from right in front of me.
It might help if you told me exactly what was stolen.
I told you it was a thing.
Does this thing have a use, or is it merely ornamental?
Does it matter?
Well, if it has a use, I'm going to have to know what it is.
Ornamental.
Then I guess there's no real emergency.
Did I say ornamental? I meant ornamentally useful.
Quark.
The actual plot is quite interesting and sees the player assume the role of a Federation diplomat called Envoy Bannock, who after returning from a hostile encounter against an unknown species in the Gamma Quadrant, gets caught up in a murder mystery on DS9, all while trying to figure out exactly who attacked him in the Gamma Quadrant and what threat it might pose to DS9. There are quite a few plot conveniences, like DS9 being evacuated due to a plasma storm, and Envoy being revealed to be an expert in just about every skill the plot requires, but on balance, it's nothing that feels dramatically out of place, and I do appreciate the fact they at least tried to come up with a reason for the station being virtually abandoned, as opposed to just glossing over it. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's head to Quark's, rent a holosuite, and head back to 1996 to remember Harbinger.
Can't you forward him a little credit, Quark? No one else is going to be using the holosuites. We're in the middle of a plasma storm.
All the more reason to insist on payment up front. Rule of acquisition number 162. Even in the worst of times, someone turns a profit.
Harbinger describes itself as a cinematic adventure game, but for me, it's closer to that of a visual novel. Now, there are moments where this is broken up, such as puzzle solving and combat, but for the most part, you'll be navigating the game in a fairly linear fashion. The main draw of the title was the so-called cinematic backgrounds, and I'll grant that these do look quite good, with a lot more detail than was featured in games like Myst. However, where Myst had excellent camera and movement, at times Harbinger struggles in this department, particularly in areas that have any curvature to them, such as Ops, where you'll end up having to traverse a room in a very unusual manner just to finish facing a required objective. To be fair, once you learn the quirks of navigation, it does become a lot better, but even in my final hour of the game, I still found myself overshooting critical objectives or positions due to the camera and in particular the perception of depth in the static image. Like I said, it's not the worst camera and movement, but it rarely feels intuitive and more often than not feels like you as a player need to accommodate for the game's unique approach to this as opposed to it operating how virtually every other game works. What does break up all of the traversal are the extensive conversations that you'll have with characters as you slowly progress through the story.
There, I'm beginning an analysis.
Let's get some answers, Lieutenant.
I don't understand. The drones here have been completely docile. They had every opportunity to strike during the evacuation.
There's a mixture of required and optional dialogue and encounters, and honestly, the game needed to get this right to keep players engaged, and it does. Like I said earlier, the game does a really good job of making you feel like you are living through an actual episode of DS9, and these dialogue sequences are a big part of why this is the case. There are some dialogue sequences which can have different responses depending on past encounters. For example, if you disagree with someone's opinion on something early on in the game, they may remind you of that in a later conversation. It's not to the stage where it really impacts the plot, but it's always nice to see these things in games. While the dialogue sections make up the majority of the gameplay experience, there are a few other mechanics the player will encounter. The first being puzzles, which are often required to unlock new parts of the story or new areas to explore, and the other being combat. Now, combat is broken up into two parts. On-foot combat, which sees the player equipped with a phaser and needing to shoot their way through various parts of the level, and space combat, which sees the player take control of a spacecraft, or in one case DS9, to deal with various threats. And look, I'm going to be honest here, I thought the combat would be really bad, but it's actually not bad at all, and it's pretty good. There's a decent level of skill required in being able to shoot at the enemies before they can shoot you, and none of the sequences outstay their welcome. In the space combat, you sometimes have the choice between phasers, the left mouse button, and photon torpedoes, the right mouse button. And on one particular level, no matter what weapon I used, I kept dying. I just couldn't destroy enough of the enemies quick enough. And then I got an idea. What if I clicked both mouse buttons at the same time? And yeah, it fired both at once, and I was able to complete the level. I have no idea if this is how the level was intended to be completed, but regardless, it worked for me. In terms of the level design, you are getting a few of the well-known locations from DS9, as well as some more alien locations. The DS9 sections all feel faithfully recreated, but the lack of additional characters in the environment really make it feel a little bland. Of course, the in-game explanation is that everyone had to be evacuated due to the plasma storm, but I get the feeling the real reason may have had something to do with technical limitations. I'm not quite sure on how this could have been solved at the time, but I do think that a little more investment in this area would have improved the overall player experience. Now, at this point in the video, you're probably thinking this game sounds pretty good, and I would agree. All of the things I've mentioned so far, in general, have been good. But now we get to a little thing called the maze. No doubt if you've played this game before, you would have just felt chills run down your spine, as the maze is easily one of the most frustrating segments of a video game I have ever played. So what exactly is a maze? Well, at one point in the game, you journey to another planet and are required to progress through a section of suspended light rails, complete with teleportation devices, to accomplish a set of tasks to progress, essentially a giant maze. Sounds simple, right? Well, no, and here's why. First of all, the maze makes no sense whatsoever plot-wise. There is literally no narrative reason that a complex multi-level maze, complete with dead ends, would exist in that area in the game. And this is reinforced by the fact that once you eventually do progress past this area, you never encounter anything like this architecture ever again. Secondly, with a maze, you would think mapping would be a critical part of your navigation. Only that in this section of the game, despite the M key serving as a map on DS9, it doesn't work while in the maze. Add to this complexity, constantly spawning in enemies which will kill you in one shot, returning you to your last save point. Right, so you have a complex maze with no map and high stakes. Sounds challenging, but not the end of the world, until you realise you need to complete a list of tasks in a very specific order to unlock the exit to the maze, which is not documented in any way in the actual level apart from the vaguest of glyphs. I spent over 2 hours trying to complete the maze. I was convinced that I had missed some type of dialogue which explained things in more detail, and I continued to backtrack looking for this. Alas, I never found any additional dialogue because it didn't exist. I very rarely use guides in games, as I like the satisfaction of discovering the solution for myself. However, in the case of the maze, it felt more like an attack on my time as a player, as opposed to presenting a puzzle. So in the end, I did use a guide, which still took me the better part of an hour to navigate the entire sequence. I'd say this is bad game design, but I don't even think it's that good. Needless to say, the maze grinds the overall pacing of the game to a halt, and if I'm honest, my experience with the game never really recovered after it, which is disappointing, as the pacing up until this moment had been pretty spot on. For a mid-90s DOS game, the overall presentation here is pretty good. The overall art style in use supports the Star Trek license well, and the FMV-like combat sections, while not winning any awards for graphical fidelity, are all quite smooth from a frame rate perspective. Menus are simple but effective, and include a screenshot for save games, something that wasn't too common for the time. Although one curious thing about the menus is that the right mouse button is used to confirm as opposed to the left, which feels a little unusual, but to be fair, it's clearly communicated. I never once encountered any bugs in the game of any type, or any performance issues whatsoever. This isn't really surprising given the game was originally designed to be played on a 486, but it's always good to know that it plays smoothly even on modern hardware. Overall, the presentation is quite strong. Now, when you have a game like a point-and-click adventure, in the absence of a 3D world to immerse yourself in, audio plays a much larger role in the overall immersion. What's here is excellent, with all of the sounds you would expect from the universe sounding exactly like they should, right down to the Cardassian transporters in use on DS9.
Envoy Bannock, welcome to Deep Space Nine. I'm Captain Benjamin Sisko, commander of the station. May I introduce my second-in-command, Major Kira Nerys, and my science officer, Lieutenant Jadzia Dax.
The voice acting does steal the show though, with all of the game cast being voiced by their real-life counterparts. All of the writing is also top-notch, and does a great job of conveying the story.
Ambassador, Envoy Bannock, you took me by surprise. I'm so glad you stopped in. I'm Quark, the owner of this establishment. What can I do for you today? A drink? A session in the holosuites?
Harbinger was a wild ride for me. Up until I reached the maze section, I was planning on publishing a video claiming it was a hidden gem and didn't deserve the criticism it received. And then, well, I hit the maze section. I actually stopped making notes for the entire maze section, mainly because I was so frustrated, but also because I knew that given how long the maze section lasts for, I wasn't going to easily forget any of my critiques for it. If you haven't played the game, then my critique around this maze might sound like an overreaction. And if you think that, I wouldn't blame you. It's hard to believe that one segment could undermine an entire game. But in this case, I'd argue that it can and does. Harbinger is a tough recommendation. On one hand, there is a great story here, which helped to pull me right back into the DS9 universe. On the other hand, the game commits an unforgivable sin in which it never really recovers from. Purists will likely find something here to enjoy, but for everyone else, it's likely a tough ask. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.